The transmission arrived at 3:47 hours, ship standard time, cutting through every Terran comm channel simultaneously. Military, civilian, diplomatic, even the ones that weren't supposed to exist. It was not a message, it was a verdict. The voice that carried it belonged to Grand Admiral Sarath Voss of the Galvath Dominion, a being who had lived 3 centuries and spent most of them watching civilizations fold. His words were precise, unhurried, and absolute. The Terran unified fleet, its colonies, its stations, and every human being drawing breath beyond the Sol system had 72 hours to submit formal documentation of surrender. All military vessels were to power down weapons and stand by for boarding. All colonial governors were to transfer authority to Dominion administrators. Earth itself would be classified as a protected cultural reserve, which, in Dominion terminology, meant a museum. The Veth had done this 43 times. They had never been refused. In the war rooms of Earth, in the command centers of 16 colonial stations, in the cramped bridges of patrol destroyers strung along the outer rim, humanity received the message, listened to it in full, and then did something that would be studied in Dominion academies for the next 200 years. They talked about it over breakfast. Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair was eating reconstituted eggs on the TFS Endurance when the message finished playing over the ship-wide comm. Around her, the mess hall was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then Sergeant Oak, a man whose body was 60% scar tissue from the Proxima insurgency, reached across the table, refilled his coffee, and said, 72 hours. That's tight. Anyone want the last of the toast? 3 people raised their hands. Fleet Admiral Mara Os received the transmission in her private quarters, standing at the viewport with a mug of black coffee, watching the slow rotation of the Kepler station docking ring. She listened without expression. When it ended, she set the mug down, picked up her datapad, and composed a reply that her communications officer would later describe as the most frightening document I have ever transmitted. It read, "Received, will be ready, TUF." 17 words, including the signature. The Dominion's translation algorithms processed it 6 times, certain they were missing context. There was no missing context. Counselor Ronthal, the Veth diplomatic observer stationed aboard neutral platform Vetra 9, was the first of his kind to see the human response land in the Dominion's central command. He was also the first to notice that it had arrived not in 72 hours, not in 24, but in 11 minutes. The humans hadn't debated. They hadn't convened emergency sessions or routed the message to 7 layers of bureaucracy. Someone somewhere had simply read the ultimatum, thought about it for the length of a coffee break, and written back. Ronthal pulled up everything the Dominion had on humanity. 43 years of observation files, behavioral analyses, economic assessments, military projections. He read until his eyes ached. The files were thorough. They documented human irrationality, human inefficiency, human biological fragility. They noted that humans lived, on average, less than a century, a lifespan the Veth considered barely enough time to complete a formal education. They noted that humans were fractious, tribal, prone to conflict among themselves. The analysts had concluded, on page 4 of a 400-page report, that humanity posed no serious military threat. Not one page of the report addressed what a species might become after millennia of surviving each other. Ronthal closed the file. He looked at Osai's 11-word reply one more time. Then he did something unusual for a Veth diplomat of his seniority. He sent an unofficial note to his superior that contained only a single line. "I think we should talk before the fleet moves." The fleet moved anyway. 72 hours later, Sarath Voss received no surrender documentation. What he received instead was a second message from the Endurance, time-stamped to the exact second his deadline expired. It contained no words at all, only a set of coordinates deep in the Kepler corridor and a date. Humanity had sent the Dominion an invitation. Ronthal had requested a transfer to the front 3 times. Each time, his superiors had denied it with the same reasoning. He was too valuable as an observer, too well-positioned on Vetra 9 to waste on a military engagement that would be over in a week. He was beginning to wish they had let him go. Watching from the outside was worse. Through Vetra 9 long-range optical arrays, he could see the Terran docking bays at Kepler Station like a man pressing his face against a window. He watched for 16 hours on the first day, cataloging everything. He was looking for signs of panic, the reliable behavioral signature of a species that had just been told it was going to be erased. Ronthal knew panic well. He had watched it reshape civilizations. It had a grammar, frantic transmissions, leadership disputes, evacuation convoys peeling away from military assets, supply chains revering direction. Panic was readable, predictable. The humans gave him none of it. What he saw instead was work. Vast, coordinated, almost cheerful work. Supply freighters moved with the efficiency of insects, guided by traffic controllers whose voices, he could pick up audio on certain frequencies, were unhurried and occasionally punctuated by laughter. A repair crew on the outer hull of the station worked in magnetic boots, patching microfractures in the thermal shielding that had been logged for maintenance months ago. One of them was, inexplicably, singing. Ronthal ran the audio through 3 translation filters before concluding that the song was not a cultural death ritual or a battle hymn. It was a song about a woman and a rainstorm, and something that had apparently happened on a Thursday. He noted this in his report and was aware, even as he wrote it, that no one in Dominion High Command would understand why it was significant. On the second day, he watched a pilot briefing through a narrowband visual intercept. The officer leading it, a young woman with close-cropped hair and grease on her left sleeve, was walking her squadron through attack vectors using a physical model built from what appeared to be food containers and a length of wire. The pilots were asking questions. Sharp questions, quick questions, the kind that meant they had been thinking hard about this for a long time. At one point, one of them said something that made half the room groan and the other half laugh, and the briefing officer threw a piece of the model at him, still smiling, and kept talking. Ronthal realized he had been holding his breath. He pulled up the Dominion's historical combat records, specifically the early campaigns against the Moor Collective and the fall of the Sarathi League. He was looking for a comparable behavioral profile, species that remained calm before overwhelming force. He found 2 documented cases. Both, he noted, had believed they possessed some decisive technical advantage that would reverse the odds. Their calm had been confidence in their weapon. He looked back at the humans. They didn't look like they were waiting for a secret weapon. They looked like people who were genuinely comfortable with the situation they were in. That was a different thing entirely, and he had no historical case for it. On the third day, he watched Fleet Admiral Osai conduct a press address for the civilian feeds. It was a thing of understatement so profound it bordered on art. She stood at a podium with the TUF flag behind her and told the assembled journalists that the Terran fleet was prepared, that all personnel were at stations, and that humanity had faced difficult odds before. A journalist asked if she was afraid. Osai looked at the camera for a moment, and here, Ronthal leaned forward because he was certain he would finally see it, the crack, the weight, the thing hiding behind the composure. Instead, the fleet admiral smiled. Not a political smile, not a performance. The genuine, private, unhurried smile of someone who has just been asked if they can swim and is standing ankle-deep in the ocean. "No," she said simply. Then she thanked everyone and walked off the podium. Ronthal sent his 4th transfer request that night. It was denied before morning. He wrote in his personal log, "They are not calm because they are not afraid. They are calm because afraid is not a category they apply to this situation. I do not know what category they are using. This frightens me more than anything I have seen in 3 decades of diplomatic service. I am watching something I do not have a word for." He paused, then added, "They are smiling, all of them. Why are they always smiling? The probe strike was Commander Velhan's idea, and at the time it seemed elegant." Velhan was a decorated officer of the Dominion's 3rd Rapid Directive, a veteran of 4 annexations who had never lost a subordinate vessel in combat. His logic was sound, by any standard the Veth military recognized. Send a destroyer squadron of 6 vessels against the smallest Terran outpost in the Kepler approach, observe the response, measure the resistance, and report the data. If the outpost fell, excellent. If it held, the battle data would be invaluable for the main engagement. Either way, the Dominion lost nothing it couldn't replace in a week. Outpost Callisto 7 was, by Veth assessment, negligible. A converted mining platform anchored to a rogue asteroid on the edge of the corridor. 4 small patrol corvettes, a garrison of approximately 200 personnel, no capital ships, no orbital defense grid worth the name. Its commander was a woman named Major Adiz Chukwu, who had spent most of her career on logistics assignments and had, according to Dominion intelligence, never commanded a ship-to-ship engagement. Velhan expected to be done in 90 minutes. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. When it was over, Velhan had 3 ships intact, 2 disabled beyond combat effectiveness, and 1 that existed only as a debris field spreading slowly across a 300-kilometer cone. He had taken 16% casualties. He had not taken Callisto 7. He sat in his command chair for a long time after the retreat, reading the battle data the way a man reads something he suspects is wrong but cannot find the error in. Chukwu had not fought defensively. That was the first thing that made no sense. With 4 corvettes against 6 destroyers, the rational strategy was to shelter behind the asteroid's mass, absorb fire from cover, and try to outlast the strike. Instead, after the first exchange, she had split her forces. 2 corvettes pulled back. 2 accelerated directly into the destroyer formation in a move Velhan's tactical system had flagged as suicidal and therefore not modeled. The 2 advancing corvettes were not attacking. They were deploying something. It took Velhan's analysts 11 minutes to identify it. Automated repair drones, broadcasting on the same sensor frequency as Dominion targeting systems, reprogrammed on the fly to act as decoys, and in 2 documented cases, rammed directly into Veth weapon arrays at full thrust. They had used their maintenance equipment as weapons, in the middle of a battle, having, presumably, thought of it during the battle. The 2 retreating corvettes, meanwhile, had used the confusion to slip behind the asteroid and emerge on the destroyer squadron's flank, a position Velhan's formation had left unguarded precisely, because it required passing through a debris field his systems had rated as too dangerous for combat maneuver. Chukwu had apparently rated it differently. Her corvettes passed through it at combat speed. Velhan's sensor log showed the pilot of the lead corvette adjusting trajectory 47 times in 6 minutes. He pulled the pilot's comm feed from the record. She was, during this period, humming. When the strike force retreated, Chukwu transmitted a standard after-action report to the Endurance. It was professional, thorough, and included a politely worded request for resupply of the repair drones she had expended. She did not mention, at any point, that she had done something no military tactician in the Dominion's 4,000-year history would have predicted or credited. Velhan filed his own report. His analysts, he wrote, believed the engagement outcome was a statistical anomaly, an artifact of terrain and luck that would not reproduce under main fleet conditions. He believed this because the alternative was harder to process, that a logistics officer commanding 4 corvettes had looked at a 6-destroyer strike force and spent the opening minutes of the battle inventing a new tactic. Grand Admiral Sarethvas read Velhan's report twice. Then he pulled the raw battle feed and watched it himself, frame by frame, for 3 hours. He did not write any notes. He sat with the data and thought about the 11-word reply to his ultimatum, and about the press conference smile, and about a species that had, apparently, evolved on a planet so hostile to life that every generation had to solve new problems just to survive another season. And he thought about what that did to a mind over 10,000 years. Then he summoned his senior staff and told them to accelerate the fleet timeline. He did not tell them what he was thinking. If he had, they might have asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. 812 warships. The number was meant to be a statement. In the 4,000-year history of the Galvath Dominion, no single military deployment had ever exceeded 600 vessels. Sarath Voss had requested 800 and been given 812, because the Dominion High Council wanted a number that was not just overwhelming but cosmically final. A number that, when transmitted alongside imagery of the assembled fleet, would do more work than any weapon. It was, by any honest measure, a beautiful and terrible thing to see. The fleet moved through the outer Kepler system in formation so precise it looked engineered rather than navigated capital ships in a triple-tiered offensive wedge, destroyers fanned in escort screens, carrier vessels holding rear position with their fighter bays already cycling. The aggregate mass of 812 vessels displaced a measurable gravitational field. The shadow they cast across the Kepler asteroid belt was, briefly, visible to the naked eye from Callisto 7. Major Chukwu stood at her outpost's viewport and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back inside and made coffee. Aboard the TFS Endurance, Fleet Admiral Mara Os convened her command staff in the main briefing room at 600 hours. She served coffee, real coffee, the kind rationed for special occasions, which told her senior officers everything they needed to know about the seriousness of the meeting before a single word was spoken. They laid it out with the careful precision of people who had been awake most of the night. Admiral Katsaros presented the fleet count, 812 confirmed, with an estimated 6 to 12 additional vessels operating under sensor blackout on the flanks. Captain Rennick covered weapons assessment. Veth Capital ship railgun batteries outranged Terran equivalents by roughly 30%, and their point defense networks were newer than anything humanity had deployed. Commander Yusuf Adara, 29 years old, the youngest officer at the table, who wrote poetry in his off hours and had a gift for pattern recognition that had made him OSI's intelligence lead, presented the projection models. 3 of them showed Terran victory under favorable conditions. 11 showed defeat. 2 he classified as unknown outcomes, insufficient data for modeling, which everyone at the table understood as a polite way of saying the variables had stopped making sense. The math, in summary, was brutal. OSI listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions, precise, technical questions about sensor range and asteroid density in the corridor's central approach, and then she sat back and was quiet for a moment. Around the table, her officers watched her the way people watch a surgeon who has just reviewed an impossible case. Then she smiled. It wasn't performative. It wasn't even entirely voluntary. It was the expression of someone whose mind had arrived somewhere the rest of the room hadn't reached yet. She reached forward and placed her finger on the holographic map, right in the center of the Kepler corridor's narrowest approach, where the asteroid density spiked and the navigable channels compressed to 3 viable paths. They have 800 ships, she said. They have to fit through here. She tapped the choke point. All 800. At some point, they will all be in one place, traveling in one direction, committed to one approach vector. She looked around the table. We've been thinking about this as a fleet action. It isn't. It's an ambush. We're just the bait. Commander Adara understood first. He leaned forward, already pulling up the asteroid survey data, already seeing the shape of it. Katsaros was 3 seconds behind him. The others followed, one by one, and the room changed, the weight in it shifting from despair to something focused and alive and dangerous. They worked for 19 hours straight. They argued, revised, discarded, rebuilt. Someone ordered food at hour 9 and nobody ate it. By the time OSI called a recess at 100, they had a plan, not a comfortable plan, not a guaranteed plan, but a plan with the specific quality that the best Terran strategies always had. It required the enemy to believe something about humanity that was slightly, crucially wrong. It required them to believe the humans were afraid. That was the easiest part to fake, because, OSI reflected, walking back to her quarters through the quiet corridors of the Endurance, the Veth had never considered that a species might choose not to show what it felt. That stillness, for humans, was not the absence of emotion. It was what emotion looked like when it had been sharpened into something useful. She slept 4 hours. She dreamed of nothing. She woke up smiling. The Battle of Kepler Corridor began at 4:12 hours on a Tuesday, which was, as Commander Adara later noted in the brief memoir he would write about it, an extremely human time to start a war. The Dominion fleet entered the corridor in precisely the formation Terran analysts had projected: the three-tier offensive wedge, capital ships forward, destroyers screening, carriers holding the rear. It was a textbook Veth formation, optimized for overwhelming firepower against a positioned enemy. It had 137 engagements in the Dominion's recorded history without significant modification, because for the Veth, a strategy that 137 times did not require modification. This was the assumption Osai had built everything around. The first phase of the battle lasted 8 minutes and looked, from the outside, exactly like what the Dominion expected: a desperate Terran defensive line attempting to hold the corridor mouth against vastly superior numbers. The Endurance and her battle group absorbed fire, fell back, absorbed more fire, fell back again. Damage reports came in. Real damage, Os had been specific about that in her briefing. She needed the Veth sensors to read genuine hull stress and actual weapons discharge. She needed them to see a fleet fighting for its life and losing. What the Veth sensors could not see was the rest of the plan. 6 weeks before the battle, Terran mining crews had worked in complete comm silence across 400 kilometers of corridor asteroid field, threading electromagnetic emitter cables through the rock. Not weapons, not shields, but signal infrastructure. A network that, when activated, would reflect and scatter Veth targeting sensors across a zone so broad that their fire control systems would require 22 seconds to recalibrate after each salvo. 22 seconds was an eternity in ship-to-ship combat. Osai knew this because Adara had calculated it twice from captured Veth technical specs, and she trusted Adara's numbers the way she trusted gravity. The network activated at minute 9. The effect on the Dominion fleet was immediate, and, to the Veth officers experiencing it, deeply disorienting. Targeting solutions dissolved. Sensor ghosts multiplied. To the electronic systems of 800 Veth warships, the Terran fleet appeared to triple in size in the space of 3 seconds, a cascade of false signatures blooming across the corridor like a second engagement had appeared from nowhere. The fleet's fire discipline, which was exceptional by any standard, held for 40 seconds. Then the first capital ship's captain, facing what his sensors told him was a flanking maneuver from a force that had not existed a minute ago, broke formation to respond. That was the thread. Osai pulled it. The Endurance reversed thrust and came forward, not retreating now, accelerating, leading her battle group directly into the compressed center of the Veth formation, where the corridor's asteroid walls funneled the fleet tight and the electromagnetic interference was thickest. Flanking groups of Terran corvettes and destroyers, hidden in the asteroid field on vectors the Veth had considered impassable, emerged simultaneously from 3 directions. They were not firing at the Veth fleet. They were firing at specific points on the corridor walls, detonating pre-positioned explosive charges that sent calculated cascades of rock and debris across the navigable channels, further compressing the formation, taking the Dominion's greatest advantage, numbers, and turning it into a liability. 800 ships in a corridor that could hold 800 ships was a fleet. 800 ships in a corridor suddenly half as wide, with targeting systems compromised and formation cohesion fracturing, was a traffic problem. The Veth capital ships, designed for open space engagements with room to maneuver, could not effectively track targets they couldn't confirm were real. The Terran corvettes, smaller and more agile, had been briefed to fly aggressive, irregular patterns that looked chaotic but were, in fact, precisely designed to maximize the electromagnetic network's distortion effect on incoming targeting locks. Sarath Voss's flagship took 3 direct hits in the first 20 minutes. Not fatal blows, the Ascendancy was built to absorb punishment, but enough to take her main battery offline and force a positional retreat that pulled the capital ship backward through its own escort screen. The Veth formation buckled, not at all points, not catastrophically, but enough. The geometric perfection that had carried the Dominion through 4,000 years of military history developed fissures, and Osai's battle group drove into every one of them like water into cracked stone. The battle lasted 9 hours and 40 minutes. When it was over, the Dominion fleet was retreating, 206 Veth vessels had been destroyed or disabled. The Terran fleet had lost 31 ships and taken heavy damage to 60 more. By the cold arithmetic of casualty ratios, it was not a decisive victory. By every other measure, strategic, psychological, historical, it was something that had never happened before. The Galvath Dominion had been made to retreat. Sarath Voss stood on the bridge of the Ascendancy as it limped back through the corridor. He watched the battle data one more time. He watched the moment the Endurance reversed thrust and came forward. He watched Osai's fleet doing something no Veth tactical model had a category for: improvising, adapting, inventing solutions inside the battle that had not existed before the battle started. And he felt, for the first time in 3 centuries of military service, the particular loneliness of a man who has just understood something terrible and cannot share it with anyone who would believe him. He thought about the smile, the 11-word reply, the singing repair crew. He thought about a species that had spent 10,000 years surviving an environment that was actively trying to kill them through ice ages, through pandemics, through wars against each other that should have ended them a dozen times, and he understood finally what he was looking at. Not soldiers, not warriors, something older than those words. Something that had been forged in a crucible so long and so hot that danger had stopped being a threat and become a language. A species for whom the unknown was not something to fear but something to solve, something to grin at. He ordered the retreat formalized and the casualty figures transmitted to high command. He did not include his personal assessment. There was no category for it on the standard form. The fleet arrived back in Dominion space in pieces, over 3 days, and the Empire felt it the way a body feels the return of blood to a numbed limb, with a rush and a sting and a sudden, unwelcome awareness of something that had not been felt in a very long time. High Command moved immediately to contain the narrative. Casualty figures were classified. The word retreat was formally replaced in all official communications with tactical reorientation, a phrase that convinced no one who had been there and confused everyone who hadn't. A committee of senior analysts was assembled to produce a report attributing the engagement outcome to terrain anomalies and unanticipated electronic interference, which was technically accurate and profoundly dishonest in the way that technically accurate things often are. It didn't hold, it couldn't, because the survivors were talking. Not publicly. Veth military culture was strict about unauthorized disclosure, and no one was filing official complaints. But in the mess halls of returning vessels, in the medical bays where the wounded waited for treatment, in the barracks of soldiers who had watched their formations come apart around them for 9 hours and 40 minutes, the story moved with the particular velocity of things that are true and witnessed and impossible to unsee. They talked about the moment the Terran fleet reversed thrust and came forward. Every soldier who had been present described the same sensation, a kind of cognitive vertigo, a split second where the tactical reality they had understood for their entire military careers simply stopped making sense. You did not advance into an 800-ship fleet. That was not a behavior pattern any of them had in their models. The first time they saw it happening on their sensors, multiple bridge crews on multiple ships had independently assumed it was a sensor malfunction. It had not been a malfunction. They talked about the electromagnetic network, the patient, meticulous, weeks-long preparation that had been invisible until the moment it wasn't. A Veth engineering officer who had spent time analyzing the captured cable sections told anyone who would listen that the installation work was extraordinary, not because of the technology, which was straightforward, but because of the planning. Because someone had looked at the Kepler corridor 400 kilometers wide and thought, I will wire this entire thing, and then had done it, in secret, while simultaneously preparing a fleet for battle. They talked about the Corvette pilots. There was a story circulating, unverified but consistent across too many independent sources to be pure fabrication, about a Terran pilot who had navigated a debris field at combat speed by shutting off her ship's automated collision avoidance, because the computer kept trying to slow her down. She had flown the last 200 kilometers on manual control, threading rock at velocities the system wouldn't permit, because the system had been designed by people who had not imagined that particular situation. She had imagined it. She had trained for it. She had, reportedly, completed the maneuver and immediately radioed her flight lead to report her position and ask if anyone needed the debris field run again. The Veth soldiers told these stories the way people tell ghost stories in low voices, with the specific unease of witnesses to something they cannot fully integrate. And the stories spread because the Dominion was not, in the end, a closed system. It had traders, diplomats, contracted workers, dozens of species moving through its administrative networks who were not Veth and who had their own communications and their own loyalties. Counselor Ronthal, still aboard Vetra 9, did not need the unofficial channels. He had access to the classified after-action data, and he read all of it with the focused attention of a man who had been right about something terrible and took no pleasure in it. He had also, in the weeks since the battle, begun receiving private messages from representatives of other species, the Murin Collective, the Sarathi Remnant, 3 of the smaller tributary civilizations that existed on the edges of Dominion space, technically autonomous and practically not. They did not ask him anything directly. They just made contact, established connection, as if they were waiting to see which way the current ran. Ronthal understood exactly what was happening. The Dominion had built its empire on the architecture of inevitability, the belief, internalized by subject species over generations, that the Veth could not be stopped, could not be surprised, could not be hurt. That architecture had not been destroyed at Kepler, but it had been cracked, and the species living under it had heard the sound. He filed a private report to his superior, not his official superior, but an older counselor named Verath who had served 50 years and was one of the few people in the Dominion's diplomatic corps whom Ronthal fully trusted. The report was 12 pages. Its central argument was simple. The battle had changed nothing militarily that could not be recovered, but it had changed everything symbolically, and symbols, in Ronthal's experience, were what empires were actually made of. Verath read it, acknowledged it, and sent back a single line, "Set up the channel, quietly." Ronthal opened the channel to the TFS Endurance the following morning. He did not know what to expect. He had studied humanity for 15 years and still felt, fundamentally, that he was studying something that did not translate cleanly into the frameworks he had been given. He sent a formal request for ceasefire talks, phrased with all the careful diplomatic language his training had given him, precise and measured and correct. The reply came back in 6 minutes. It read, "We're available Thursday. OSA." He sat with that for a while. Then, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he laughed. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of days that know they are going to be remembered. Ronthal came aboard the TFS Endurance through a docking collar rather than a formal honor guard. His own request, in the interests of discretion, though he suspected the Terrans would have made it remarkable if he'd asked for ceremony. He was met at the airlock by a young lieutenant who shook his hand with a grip that was confident without being a statement about it, and walked him through corridors that smelled of metal and recycled air, and faintly, of whatever the crew had eaten for breakfast. The ship had taken damage at Kepler. He could see the repair work neat, efficient, unhurried, running along sections of hull plating and conduit that had been replaced in the weeks since the battle. The Endurance had been hit hard. It had been fixed and was flying. Ronthal noted this without surprise and with a great deal of respect. The briefing room where Osai met him was not large. A table, 8 chairs, a holographic map currently showing nothing, just the ambient star field of the corridor, a carafe of something hot. Osai was already seated when he arrived, in working uniform rather than dress whites, which told him either she didn't stand on ceremony or she wanted him relaxed enough to be honest. He suspected both. She stood when he came in, which was a human custom he found unexpectedly graceful, and poured 2 cups from the carafe before he had a chance to decline. It turned out to be tea. Veth tea, the good kind, which meant someone had done research and cared enough to act on it. He filed that away. "Counselor," she said, not his full title, Not the diplomatic honorific the occasion technically warranted. Just the one word, warm and direct, the way a person speaks to someone they've decided they're going to be straight with. "Admiral," he replied in kind. They sat, they drank their tea. Outside the viewport, the Kepler corridor drifted in slow starlight. Ron Thal had prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He had scenarios, fallback positions, leverage analyses, red lines. He had anticipated demands for territory, for reparations, for formal admission of Dominion culpability, all the usual architecture of a victorious power extracting its due from a humbled one. He had prepared for the version of this meeting where Osai sat across from him the way winners sit, forward, certain, with the weight of consequence on their side. She didn't sit that way. She sat the way someone sits when they have already made their decisions and have no particular need to perform them. "We want 3 things," she said without preamble. "Free passage for all non-Veth species through current Dominion space, no tributary tariffs, no administrative seizure of vessels, no residency restrictions. Full dissolution of the tributary taxation system across all affiliated civilizations within 5 years. And a seat on the Galactic Council for the Terran Unified Nations, voting rights, full standing, same as any other member." Ron Thal waited for the rest. There was no rest. "That's it," he said, and heard in his own voice an embarrassing note of confusion. "That's it," Osai said. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without particular intensity, not triumphant, not cold, just present. The way a person looks when they've said a true thing and have nothing to add to it. "Admiral," he said carefully, "you have, by any reasonable strategic assessment, a position of considerable strength in this negotiation. The Dominion's forward fleet is diminished. Its public credibility has taken a significant—" "I know what our position is," Osai said, not unkindly. "Then why?" "Because we didn't fight this war to build an empire." She set down her cup. "We fought it because you showed up at our door and told us to kneel. We don't kneel, that's really the whole thing." She glanced at the star map, then back at him. "We don't want your systems, we don't want your tribute. We want to be left alone to live the way we want to live, and we want the other species in this galaxy to have the same option." She paused. "That's not negotiable. Everything else, timelines, implementation frameworks, verification mechanisms, is a conversation I'm happy to have." Ron Thal was quiet for a long time. In 3 decades of diplomacy, he had sat across from representatives of 16 civilizations in negotiating positions ranging from desperate to victorious. He had a taxonomy for it, a way of reading power through posture and language, and the things people chose not to say. He had no category for this. He had no entry in his taxonomy for a victor who wanted less than they could take and meant it. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you're asking will substantially alter the structure of the Dominion's administrative economy." "Yes," Osai said. "I imagine it will also substantially improve the lives of several billion non-Veth beings currently living under your administration." He couldn't argue with that. He had never quite managed to argue with the truth of it, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "I'll need to take this to high command," he said. "Of course." She refilled his cup. "I've prepared a secondary channel for back and forth on technical points. Commander Adara will be your contact. He's thorough and he's patient and he's very good at this. So please don't try to outmaneuver him on the data. It's a waste of both your time." Ron Thal thought about pointing out that he was one of the most experienced diplomatic negotiators in the Dominion. He thought about Adara's age, 29, barely past Veth adolescence, and about everything he had learned in the past months about the relationship between youth and capability in human beings. He said nothing. He stood to leave. At the door he stopped. "May I ask you something personal?" Osai leaned back in her chair. "Sure." "The first reply you sent to the ultimatum, 11 words," he looked at her. "Were you afraid when you wrote it?" She considered the question with what seemed like genuine attention, not performing reflection, actually doing it. "I was afraid of losing people," she said finally. I was afraid of what would happen to the colonies if we got this wrong. She picked up her cup. But the fight itself, she shook her head slightly. No, not really. She looked at him the way she had looked at the journalist who had asked the same question in a very different context. We've been in fights our whole history, our whole species' history. We know how to do this. The corner of her mouth moved. We just needed to make sure we were doing it on the right ground. He nodded, he left. Walking back through the corridor to the docking collar, he passed the junior lieutenant who had met him at the airlock. The young man was working on a wall panel, tracing what looked like a new conduit run through the repaired section. He had his toolkit open, components laid out with methodical care. He was humming something under his breath. Ronthal stopped. What are you humming? The lieutenant looked up, slightly startled. Sorry, an old song, sir, from Earth. My grandmother used to sing it. What is it about? The lieutenant thought about it. A woman who walked into a storm, he said, and decided she liked it. Ronthal walked the rest of the way to the airlock in silence. 1 year later, the galaxy remembered. The first full session of the reformed Galactic Council opened on a neutral station. Not Dominion territory, not Terran, but Vetra 9 itself, which had witnessed more of the preceding year's events than any other fixed point in the corridor region and seemed, by some collective instinct, the appropriate place to mark what came next. The station had been expanded in 3 months of construction, a new assembly chamber grafted onto its midsection, with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting a very long time for the room to be needed. 17 species were present. 11 of them had never attended a council session as full voting members. Some had never attended as anything at all. Commander Yusuf Adara represented the Terran Unified Nations. He was 29 years old and had spent the year since Kepler in the work of implementation, the treaty language, the timeline negotiations, the 1,000 practical details of dismantling a 4,000-year-old economic system without causing the kind of collapse that would hurt the very people the dismantling was meant to help. He had written 4 poems about it, none of which he had shown anyone. He was good at his job in the way that people are good at things they were designed for, and he carried the work with the particular lightness of someone who understood what it was for. He spoke briefly in the opening session, not a speech exactly, more a statement of position. He thanked the council for its assembly. He acknowledged the Veth delegation, which was present, subdued, and watching him with the careful attention of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. He said that humanity did not come to this council as a victor with a doctrine, but as a species with a point of view, and they were very much looking forward to hearing everyone else's. Then he sat down and listened for most of the rest of the day, which was, several senior delegates later agreed, exactly the right thing to do. Ronthal was present as the Dominion's chief diplomatic representative, a role that had expanded considerably in the past year, since it turned out that one of the primary qualifications for navigating a post-Kepler Dominion was having actually understood, in real time, what was happening. He had spent most of the past 12 months being either invaluable or extremely inconvenient depending on which Dominion official you asked. He had also, in the quieter moments, continued the irregular personal correspondence he had opened with Osai in the months after the ceasefire, not official communications, just exchanges. She had a dry humor that was difficult to translate and a habit of asking questions that seemed simple until you tried to answer them. The session ended in the early evening of Vetra 9 artificial day cycle, and the delegates moved to the reception hall with the collective energy of people who had accomplished something real and were allowing themselves, cautiously, to feel it. Adara found himself standing near a viewport with a delegate from the Murin Collective, an older woman named Teth, who had lived under Dominion tributary administration for 60 years and had attended today's session as her civilization's first fully recognized council representative. She had been quiet through most of the formal proceedings, watching with the focused stillness of someone filing everything away. "What do you think?" Adara asked, because he genuinely wanted to know. Teth looked at the stars for a moment. "I think it is very strange," she said carefully, "to sit in a room where no one is afraid." Adara looked around the reception hall. Delegates from 17 species, talking, arguing gently, navigating the particular social complexity of a gathering where everyone was figuring out who everyone else was for the first time. It was, he thought, a lot like every meeting he had ever been in. "We've always found rooms like this loud," he said. Teth laughed, a small, surprised sound like something she hadn't used in a while. "You're Admiral Osai," she said. "I have heard a great deal about her. Will she be attending any future sessions?" "She'll be at the second session," Adara said. "She had to finish a refit of the Endurance. She takes that personally." "What is she like in person?" Adara thought about this. "She's the calmest person I've ever been in a crisis with," he said. "Which sounds simple, but it's the most complicated thing I know how to say about her." Teth nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she had already half believed. Across the galaxy, on a quiet estate on the Dominion's third home world, Grand Admiral Sarath Voss, retired now 8 months, by choice sat in a garden under a sky the color of old copper, and received a visit from a young scholar named Veen, who was writing a historical account of the Kepler Corridor engagement. Veen had good questions, and the intelligence not to fill silences that didn't need filling, which was why Sarath Voss had agreed to see him. They talked for 3 hours. At the end, Veen put down his recorder and asked the question he had been building toward all afternoon, the one he'd been afraid to ask in the middle because he'd needed the rest of the conversation first. "What were they really like?" he asked. "The humans in the battle." Sarath Voss was quiet long enough that the copper sky shifted toward evening. "Imagine," he said at last, "a species that has known darkness for so long that it stopped being afraid of it. That looked at death and decided it was just another problem to solve. That built laughter the way other species build walls not to hide behind but to stand on." He paused. "They came into that corridor knowing what they were facing. They had done the math. They knew the numbers as well as we did, probably better." He looked at his hands, which were old and still, and had given orders he would spend the rest of his life examining. And they came anyway, not because they didn't understand the danger, because they understood it completely and decided it wasn't the most important thing in the room. Veen wrote nothing, he just listened. "The smile," Sarath Voss said. "Everyone talks about the smile. I have thought about it for a year. I think I finally understand it." He looked up. "It is not arrogance, it is not performance. It is what a face does when it has made peace with the worst possible outcome and found on the other side of that peace something worth fighting for." He was quiet. "We could not break them because they were not holding themselves together with fear. Fear can be used against a species. It is leverage. You take away what they are afraid of losing, or you make the threat large enough and the fear does your work for you." He shook his head. "They were not afraid, and you cannot leverage something that is not there." Veen did write that down. "Will there be another war," he asked, "between the Dominion and the Terrans?" Sarath Voss considered this for a long time. "No," he said, "not because we could not rebuild the fleet, not because the political will could not be reconstructed." He looked at the evening sky. "Because the Empire has seen what they are now, what they actually are, under the reports and the projections and the intelligence assessments." He was quiet. "You do not go back to a fire that has already shown you it cannot be put out. You learn to live with its light." Veen closed his recorder. He thanked the old admiral. He left through the garden gate and stood for a moment on the path outside, looking up at a sky full of stars, each one a sun, each sun a system, each system changed in small ways or large, but genuinely and permanently changed by the events of the past year. Somewhere out there, beyond the corridor, beyond the Dominion's reach, a species was going about its ordinary business, eating breakfast, fixing ships, singing songs about Thursday afternoons and rainstorms, carrying, in its ordinary bones, something that 4,000 years of empire had never encountered and would never fully comprehend. The galaxy did not fear humanity. It had done something more lasting than that. It remembered them. And in the remembering, very quietly, it had begun to change. And